Signs you're healing from inside, and the uncomfortable truth about transformation. You've been doing the work. You've been going to therapy, you've been journaling, you've been setting boundaries, and maybe you've been cutting back in drinking or quit entirely. But something feels off, and you're more emotional than before. You're noticing things about yourself that make you uncomfortable, and relationships feel harder and not easier. And somewhere in the back of your mind, there's this nagging fear. Am I getting worse? What if I told you that what feels like falling apart might actually be the real sign that you're finally healing? So today we're exploring the paradox of the psychological healing, because the truth is that the transformation rarely feels the way that you expect it to. So there's a myth of healing is comfortable. Let's start by dismantling this dangerous myth that healing should feel good, that it's peaceful, and it's the gentle unfolding into wellness. We are sold this idea constantly that self-care Sunday, the bubble bath, the positive affirmation, the promise that you will just practice gratitude and everything will magically feel better. But here's what psychology really says about this thing, that real healing often feels very deeply uncomfortable. And not just because you're doing it wrong, but because you're finally doing it right. When you are in survival mode, whether it's from a trauma or from an addiction or from chronic stress, your mind prioritizes logic over feeling. And emotions are very dangerous when you're trying just to get through your day. So you develop usually a very sophisticated way of coping with not feeling, and it's by staying busy, using substances to numb you out, or simply by disconnecting your body entirely. So think about alcohol specifically. For many people, drinking became the way to manage uncomfortable emotions, and without actually feeling them, they just numb them. So stress after work, drink, or take the drink to take the edge off. You're feeling anxious, drink. Alcohol really quiets down that internal critic. And neurologically, alcohol dampens the activity of your prefrontal cortex. So it creates a chemical buffer between you and your feelings. And it feels like a relief, but it is actually preventing you from processing and integrating the real healing process and the real healing emotions. So true healing begins when you transition from that survival state. So in that transition, how does it feel? It really doesn't feel like a relief. It feels like you're finally thawing after being frozen. And that hurts sometimes. As Dr. Gaber Mate says, you are faced with two pains: the acute temporary pain of setting boundaries and being yourself, or the chronic soul crushing pain of suppressing who you are just to be accepted. The discomfort isn't a sign of failing. It is the evidence that you are not longer surviving, but you're actually alive. The first paradox sign of healing that often people panic about is that you're suddenly feeling more and not less. And maybe you've stopped drinking for 3 months and suddenly you're crying at commercials. Or you've been doing therapy for 6 months and now you're very angry at your partner or your parents because you feel that you've never been yourself. This is very common when people change their relationship with alcohol. They expect to feel better immediately. They expect to feel cleaner and more energized. But while those things do happen eventually, emotionally something else occurs. It is a flood of feelings that were numb and that you were keeping at bay. One person described it perfectly. I changed my drinking habits, expecting to feel free. But instead, I felt everything. I felt every disappointment I numbed, every anxiety I'd silence, every grief that I postponed. When a painful emotion arises that we can't process, we use our defense mechanisms to keep that emotion out of our conscious awareness. But those emotions don't disappear, and they go to what psychoanalysts call the unconscious. They're waiting for a moment when you are finally safe enough so you can feel them. Alcohol is a very effective way to keeping that door locked. And when you remove it or you reduce it significantly, that door starts to open. So when those long buried feelings start emerging, it's not a breakdown. It is your psyche way of saying you're finally stable enough to process this. So when those long buried feelings start emerging, it's not a breakdown. It is your psyche's way of saying you are finally ready and stable enough to process. And your nervous system has assessed that you are no longer chemically suppressing these signals. That anger that you've been feeling towards your mother, it might be anger you couldn't express at the age of 7, and then spend decades numbing with wine. And that grief from your childhood, you couldn't feel at that moment because you were still living it. After years of suppression, you are allowing yourself to feel those long buried anger or sadness or grief. That is a big step. It is painful, yes, but it also means that you're moving towards the integration and not away from it. The second sign of healing is that increased self-awareness that it often feels like discovering an uncomfortable truth about yourself. So you start realizing that you've been people-pleasing for decades, or how you use humor to deflect real intimacy, or how you've been unconsciously choosing patterns that you recreate those childhood dynamics that you used to have. When alcohol is part of your coping strategy, it often masks patterns. You might not notice that you feel uncomfortable socially, or that alcohol can help you tolerate relationships that aren't actually serving you. Whether you choose abstinence or moderation, both paths bring clarity. So it isn't always comfortable. Suddenly you can see how much your social life was built around alcohol and drinking, or how that fun and spontaneous version of yourself only showed up after a couple of glasses of wine. So another sign of healing might be the most socially uncomfortable, and that you start to set boundaries. And this is bringing an intense fear and guilt. For many people, alcohol becomes the primary way to tolerate having no boundaries. You say yes to every social obligation, even when you're exhausted, and then you drink to get through it. You let people talk to you in ways that you feel disrespectful. So for many people, alcohol becomes the primary way to tolerate having no boundaries. So you say yes to every social obligation, even when you are feeling exhausted. Or when you let people talk to you in disrespectful ways, then you drink to quiet that resentment. So when you set your first real boundary is, I can't take that call right now, I'm not drinking tonight, and I don't want to discuss it, I'm only having one drink, your nervous system goes often into that panic mode. Why? Because in your formative relationships, asserting your needs might have led to a withdrawal of love, or might have led to anger or abandonment. And your system learned that boundaries equal danger. One of the most challenging aspects of changing your relationship with alcohol is that it often requires setting boundaries in a culture that treats drinking as a default. The no thank you, I'm not drinking shouldn't be so controversial. But for many people, it triggers an intense social anxiety. That anxiety isn't irrational. You are challenging not only your own internal patterns, but patterns from everyone around you. Your boundaries become a mirror that reflect on their relationship with their drinking. So not everyone wants to look at that mirror. That guilt you feel when you decline or you stop drinking after one glass is not an evidence that you're doing something wrong. It is an evidence that you're doing something different. And that is a different system that what was taught to you or how you trained yourself before. So remember that Dr. Gaber Mate framework is you can have an acute pain of not being accepted when you set a temporary boundary, or you can have a chronic pain of not being yourself. The first pain is temporary and it leads to growth. The second pain leads to a permanent resentment and leads to disconnection and a very self-destructive coping mechanism. Another sign of healing is that you're grieving losses that you didn't even know you experienced. So maybe you're grieving something from your childhood, and maybe you're grieving that your emotional needs were not met at that time. And if you change your relationship with alcohol, you might be also grieving the loss of your primary coping mechanism. And even when that coping mechanism was hurting you, it was also serving a function. It helped you to get through your days, it made you more social, or it made social situation a little bit more manageable. Losing that, even when it's not the healthiest choice, can feel like grief. And you're mourning the version of yourself that could just have fun and without worrying about how much you were drinking. You are grieving the simplicity of being able to numb your emotions, and you're dealing with feeling a little too much right now. Healing doesn't mean that you forget the pain and that it just vanishes away. It means that you're learning to carry it while you're continuing to experience joy and growth and have a full life. You don't get over the fact that your emotional needs were never met, or that trauma that you dealt with when you were younger. You grieve it. You acknowledge it. You don't get over the fact that your emotional needs were never met as a child. You grieve it and you acknowledge what was missing, and then you learn how to meet those needs for yourself now. And you don't have to pretend that changing your relationship with alcohol is only positive. You can acknowledge that you're losing stuff, and you don't have to pretend that changing your relationship with alcohol, for example, it's only positive. You can acknowledge what you're losing and recognize what you're gaining. And this grief is not a sign of failure. Another sign that you're healing from inside is the existential discomfort. What does that mean? It means that as you heal, your identity itself may feel a little bit unstable. If you build an identity around being the strong one, what happens when you start admitting that I may need help? If you've always been the fun one at the parties because of alcohol, who are you when you stop drinking or start limiting yourself? This identity crisis, it's very intense, especially for people who use alcohol like as a social lubricant for years. Your entire social identity have been built around drinking. And when you adopt abstinence or commit to moderation, you're not just changing a habit, you are questioning who you are and who is the real you. The anxious person who emerges when you're not drinking, or the confident person who show up after drinking? Neither, really. You're discovering that you're more complex than either version, and that complexity can feel a little bit destabilizing. This confusion isn't a regression. It's actually a progression towards authenticity. You're in what therapists call the fertile void, that uncomfortable space between who you are and who you are becoming. So here's what I want you to remember. If healing feels harder than you expect, more uncomfortable, more destabilizing, that doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It means you're finally doing it right. You're walking through the storm. The discomfort you're experiencing, it's an evidence that, first, your nervous system finally feels safe, and that it's safe enough to process what it has been holding. Second, that you're developing awareness of the patterns that have been running unconsciously. Third is that you're choosing authenticity over approval. Fourth is that you're grieving. And fifth is that you're discovering who you actually are beneath the protective layers. Real healing often feels like things are getting worse before they can get better. Not because the process is flawed, but it's because you're finally dealing with what was always there. Just hiding underneath a very sophisticated coping mechanism like alcohol or being busy or emotional numbing. What if the discomfort you're feeling isn't an evidence that you're broken, but the evidence that you are finally brave enough to feel what it needs to be felt? What if the confusion about who you are without coping mechanisms isn't losing yourself, but it's finally finding yourself? Healing isn't about returning to who you were before the pain. It is about integrating everything you've experienced and becoming someone new, someone who can hold both joy and grief, strength and vulnerability, boundaries and connection. And someone can feel their emotion without needing to chemically manage them. Trust the discomfort is not your enemy, it's your healing, and you're finally allowed to unfold. If you want to check more about these and other topics, please download the app Unconscious Moderation and start the journey of healing today.